Hello and welcome to part 4 of An Idiot Explains the Universe. I want to ask you a question. Why is it that we can imagine infinity, but we can't imagine the time before the Big Bang? We can imagine infinite possibilities, but we lack the skills at imagining nothingness. To imagine a time before time, a space before space, would mean stepping outside the self. But we can't subtract our consciousness from our imagination. Everything is filtered through our senses and our ability to perceive and imagine. Today, I would like to talk about consciousness, and in order to do that, we'll have to separate ourselves from it. I was able to do this 3 times in my life thanks to a chronic condition called a histamine intolerance. It's a debilitating condition that keeps me awake at night. In my early 30s, I discovered Benadryl, so I was able to overcome the histamine keeping me awake. But the majority of my life was spent in a dazed fugue state. Because of this, I was able to have extraordinary experiences thanks to the lack of sleep. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because during those fleeting moments where I've experienced nothingness, I was able to separate myself from myself. I was no longer my thoughts. I was merely an observer, an onlooker. But the only way for me to remain impartial was to be absent of thought, which is hard, even for me. Please keep in mind that this is impossible to explain. It could only be felt emotionally. We can easily imagine the time before we are born. There's a very long line of umbilical cords connecting us to the beginning of all of mankind. That's a lot of umbilical cords. Let me ask ChatGPT how much umbilical cord was needed to create me. Beep, boop, beep. The dawn of man stretches back 12,000 generations, which isn't a very large number if you ask me. As for the length of umbilical cord, it has taken approximately 3.74 miles of umbilical cord to create me. Coincidentally, 3.74, it's the magic number that separates us from chaos. Look up chaos theory and bifurcation theory for examples of that. Is our generation the one where chaos reigns? Oh shoot, I'm getting off topic. I'm supposed to be talking about consciousness. This is a tall order, but I think I'm up for the challenge. Consciousness can't be measured or explained with mathematics or hard science, which causes the topic of consciousness to fall in the realm of philosophy or psychology. Consciousness has to be a non-mathematical study. But for the sake of this video, let's try to connect consciousness to hard science. In order to do that, a thought must be seen as a physical object that we can measure and study, such as microscopic waves. Unfortunately, the reason why consciousness can't be studied in this manner is simply because thoughts are not made of matter. Thoughts are complex, emergent phenomena that arise from the interplay of electrical signals, chemical processes, and patterns of neural activity in the brain. While electromagnetic waves are a measurable byproduct of this activity, they are not thoughts themselves. Instead, thoughts represent the dynamic organization and processing of information within the brain's neural networks. Instead of delving into brain science, I would like to focus on why we are conscious in the first place. It is highly unlikely that consciousness arises simply to keep us breathing and our hearts pumping. As long as our organs have a steady supply of oxygen, they can function just fine even if our EEG flatlines. The brain also does more than simply decipher information from our senses. if we were to be stripped of our senses, our brain would still function. Many scientists believe that consciousness is like a steam whistle on a train, a byproduct of the engine's activity that doesn't affect how the engine works. This view suggests that free will is an illusion and that consciousness merely watches decisions being made by the train. Brain. During my histamine-induced glimpses of separation from self, I was able to see my own steam whistle. I saw the steam rise up, swirl around with the same circular thoughts getting fed by the processes happening below my conscious state. In this sense, the steam that I witnessed was in fact my consciousness. And from what I can tell, there was no free will involved. Hold that thought. I'm not done with it. Let me explain. As irrational as this sounds, this theory of consciousness being emergent from subconscious processes makes the most logical sense. We have empirical evidence that showcases the irrefutable claims of cause and effect. Most of science is based on cause and effect. Classical physics, biology, and chemistry rely heavily on it. It seems to act as the unspoken common sense rule. Physical objects can affect other physical objects in predictable ways. It's easy, it's intuitive, and it's common sense. A brain, for instance, processes 10 quadrillion bits of information per second. It is processing information that we don't even know about, and it's happening right now in our heads without our help or knowledge. The brain is physical, with physical properties such as electromagnetic waves and other such neural activity, and despite all this empirical evidence, scientists, many of whom refute the idea that consciousness arises from a natural physical functioning brain. These are people who view the world in terms of logic. They view it in terms of tried and tested theories, and yet they refuse to believe this common sense theory that our consciousness is emerging from physical matter. Why do they argue against it? Because of subjective experience. For the fact that we can see red or taste chocolate. While science can explain the brain's mechanics, it struggles to explain the subjective aspect of experience. There lies the gap, and it's a very clear, clean gap in our understanding. This is an example of the whole being more than the sum of its parts. Our consciousness is a unified, subjective experience arising from separate physical processes in our brain, most of which we are not conscious of. It's also hard to reconcile the idea that consciousness has no causal power with the fact that we make deliberate, intentional decisions all the time. We are the ones in charge, not the mechanics of our brains, but us, our free will. In other words, if you didn't understand what I just said, I'll explain it another way. If consciousness has no real effect on what happens, if it doesn't cause anything, then how do we explain the fact that we feel like we're making intentional, deliberate decisions all the time? If our awareness means nothing, then what purpose does it serve? If our brain mechanics alone can function well enough to keep us alive and thriving in our communities, where does awareness play into all that? Another key argument is, why would consciousness exist if it has no evolutionary utility? If consciousness were just a byproduct, why would it evolve through natural selection? Why would our ancestor, a single-cell amoeba, evolve consciousness if it was not needed? So, as you can see, there are two theories of thought, the materialists and the dualists. All of those other theories are offshoots of these two. I would like to form my own hypothesis from all this information and tie it in with my fleeting experiences with my histamine-induced separations from thought. You see, while I was able to see my own stream emerge from my train, the steam being my thoughts and the train being my subconscious, it was in that space where I truly felt aware and conscious. It was there where I had true free will, possibly for the first time in my life. This is proof to myself that the two theories of consciousness, the materialist versus the dualist, are both correct. From my experience, the consciousness that we use in everyday life is in fact steam from the train, nothing but an emergent byproduct formed by trillions of processes happening beneath the surface. But there is a much deeper awareness within that unfortunately we just cannot reach, but I know it's there. Another me looking at me, and to be honest, I seemed insane. The same thoughts were regurgitated over and over in a never-ending loop. Anyway, if materialists see consciousness arising as a steam whistle, what do dualists believe? Dualists believe that mind is separate from the body, not necessarily in the sense that mind equals soul, but more like a theory that mental states can affect our physical body because they are two distinct entities coexisting in one body. This has actually been proven. It's been tried and tested that the mind does in fact exert influence over our physical states. Idealism, which is an offshoot of duality, goes even further. Idealists believe that the mind can affect not just one's own physical well-being, but also the world in general. However, if my true conscious self, the one that has absolute free will, is buried so deep inside me, it's highly unlikely I can utilize her to affect all physical matter, as idealism theorizes. She is too unobtainable. She might be obtainable during deep meditation, but other than that, I can't reach her. Not even with strong hallucinogens. Let me form another hypothesis. It's not really a hypothesis. It's more like a what-if question. As I stated earlier, the brain can process 10 quadrillion bits of information per second, but it only needs 50 bits per second for conscious self-awareness to emerge. This is fact. It's not a what-if scenario. My what-if question is, since one human somatic cell can process between 1 million and 100 million bits of information per second, while only 50 bits per second are needed for consciousness, wouldn't that imply that a single cell has the capacity for consciousness? Of course, not in the same sense that us humans have, but would it imply that it can at least sense contrasts, therefore showcasing a form of perception? As I mentioned in part 2 of my series, perception is all that is needed to give rise to consciousness. And this type of atomic consciousness, when tied in with the train and the steam whistle analogy, what if that steam from that little atom can be found in all matter? It's not conscious as we believe ourselves to be, but a byproduct from underlying processes taking place. It's an emergent phenomena, one that does not include free will, but a deterministic fate. In essence, this consciousness would run as a program without a soul there to witness itself. This brings me to a deep dive portion of the video. It's time to roll up my sleeves and get down and dirty, or as Will Smith would put it, get jiggy with it. Let's start with something easy, our ability to see color. It's a subjective experience to see color. It's an unexplainable ability that we have, the ability to not only see color, but to dream in color. Did you know that before color TV was invented, people only dreamt in black and white? Light and color wouldn't exist without perception. They consist only of wavelengths. We can't see these wavelengths without some kind of sensory processor, aka our brain, or a mechanical tool such as a demodulator. Without these tools, we wouldn't be able to see or hear anything. I'll make a separate video about how the brain processes light and color because it's fascinating. But in this video, I would like to stay on the topic of consciousness. How does color arise? Let's pretend that an atom is a high-rise building and that electrons live on the floors of this high-rise. When an electron jumps from a higher energy level to a lower one, it releases energy as light. The wavelength of this light depends on the energy difference between the levels, which is influenced by, drumroll please, the Fiine Structure Constant. And thus, a color is born from this wavelength. The wavelength hits our rods, letting us see light, while our cones decipher the wavelength which gives rise to color. The Fiine Structure Constant acts as a barrier between these different levels of energy. It sounds simple enough. There's nothing weird about that, but it is weird. And I'll tell you why. There is nothing influencing it. Let me break down what the Fiine Structure Constant is. It's a number, 1 over 37. That's the amount of space between each floor if an atom were to be imagined as a high-rise. This very specific number has no known origin. Let me give you an analogy with the equation of pi. Pi equals the circumference of a circle divided by its diameter, and the answer always comes out to pi, no matter what. It's a universal constant consisting of no dimensions, just like the Fiine Structure Constant. But unlike pi, which is derived from mathematics, the value of the Fiine Structure Constant appears arbitrary. Light is made up of electromagnetic waves. The Fiine Structure Constant, 1 over 37, controls the strength of the electromagnetic force of these waves. This force governs how electrons in atoms absorb and emit light. It indirectly influences the speed of light. But the thing is, it's not a force. It's just a number that physicists achieve when they plug in the numbers to an equation. I won't get into the specifics of this equation. I'll just say that the figures have to do with the speed of light, the Planck length, the permittivity of space, and the charge of an electron. The thing is, when all these numbers are plugged into the equation, they end up canceling each other out. The most logical explanation for the Fiine Structure Constant is that there are deeper physics involved that we don't yet understand. But as I said in part 3, the physics below the Planck length are unknowable and will most likely never be knowable, because in order for us to physically delve beneath the Planck length, it would take so much energy that we would inadvertently create a black hole, because smaller distances require shorter wavelengths, which correspond to higher energies, and these higher energies according to Einstein's general relativity, warp the fabric of space-time in a way that gives rise to gravity. So, how can there be deeper physics involved when below the Planck length time itself breaks down? Oh, and I forgot. If the fine structure constant was off by even just a little smidge, we wouldn't even be here. Shifting gears. Everything is a wave until it touches something other than itself. Light and color don't exist. They only exist in our mind. This is factual, not philosophical. If a tree falls in a forest, according to physics, it doesn't make a sound if no ears are there to hear it. And just because we have machines that can decode and project these images, we still need eyes and ears to decode the decoder, such as a radio or a television. Everything we see here, they're only waves, nothing more, nothing less. Light and color, including sound, contains no inherent substance on its own. It's merely information, it's a wave, it's waiting to be measured and observed. If we were to see reality for what it truly is, we'd live in perpetual darkness. Waves and particles would still be there, but with no eyes to see them and no ears to hear them, they'd never show their true potential. Now, I want you to visualize this darkness while I refresh your memory of part 2 of my series. The information in part 2 is needed in order to finally tie everything together with a cute little bow. To sum up part 2, I basically explained that all matter is in the process of decohering its environment, which isn't necessarily just a theory, but a proven fact. At least, I'm pretty sure it's been proven. But this implies that all matter is entangled until it's observed. The observer doesn't have to be a conscious observer. It can be anything that touches the entangled particle. But in order for this to happen, there must be some form of perception, and I believe that this perception is an emergent phenomena which arises between the splits of differentiating charged electrons because, according to me, perception is found in the contrasts, as I stated in part 2. In other words, the fine structure constant allows the necessary wiggle room that gives rise to perception. And if only 50 processes need to take place in order for consciousness to arise, there's nothing stopping that little particle from having the ability to perceive, thus creating energy, creating movement, light, color, and sound. Energy is created when touched by contrasts. Therefore, a form of perception is needed in order to decode these contrasts. I believe a form of perception is being performed between the splits, between the floors of differentiating energy levels between electrons. The fine structure constant allows room for a quantum entangled handshake, so to speak. I have a tendency to repeat myself, and so I'll remind you once again that information, just as it is with energy, never ceases to exist. Since information becomes embedded in the fabric of space, and the past is indeed encoded in this tiny electron, it possesses a type of experience, a memory or a quantum scar that can distinguish new information presented to it from the old information it has stored in its past. And this process is so fundamental that it's encoded into our universe as 1/137, the fine structure constant. the boundary in which contrasts are created, the friction needed to ignite entropy to create life, literally. Materialists believe that everything arises out of cause and effect from physical matter. To me, this can be compared to classical physics and general relativity. Everything can be measured and determined with math. And then there is the wacky world of quantum mechanics, where anything goes, chaos reigns and nothing is for certain. A perfect place for dualists to settle in. Just as there is no unified theory for the universe, we also lack a unified theory for consciousness. Using my little brain and the few gifts God gave me, I fully believe that hybrids exist. All of these theories are true. But my gifts have a limit. None of these theories can tell me where my second consciousness came from. Perhaps I was shown only a glimpse of my ego. I was shown the byproduct of some conscious processes. The deterministic part of myself that is as natural as growing grass. No true free will. And I will forever be trapped here in the illusion of free will, while this onlooker, who witnessed my steam whistle from my train, is the true separate entity. But where did this onlooker come from? I speculate that this onlooker is in fact my soul. What if the idealists are right? Idealists are the ones that believe the soul can influence the world around them. And this self-aware onlooker that I was able to become for those 2 seconds is in actuality the girl behind the curtain. But she only had 2 seconds of empowerment, and she used that time to look at herself, to witness her own imprisonment. Don't get me wrong, you guys. I'm still very much an agnostic, and I'm sure that this onlooker that was viewing my thoughts, I'm sure that onlooker could be explained with science, but the fact remains that I was able to see myself for the first time in my life. I saw myself for who I really was, and I had full self-awareness. And what I saw was insanity. And that's where I'll leave you for now. In my next episode, I will like to discuss more about what physical matter actually is. But once I start writing the script to these videos, I tend to veer off topic, so I can't say for certain what I'll talk about in my next video. Like always, I'll use logic and science to base my hypothesis on. Until next time, quantum quackers, stay open and amazed.